Who killed Wallaga Lake? But firstly, what the frack is an ICOLL? Wallaga Lake is an ICOLL. Though, you don't know what an ICOLL is, do you? And you're not the slightest bit interested in what it is, are you? But when you go on a holiday, do you want to have access to a pristine waterway bursting with aquatic life? So, what does ICOLL stand for? Well, it is an intermittently closed and open lakes and lagoons. These are estuaries that become blocked by a build-up of marine sand which forms a berm across their mouth, and they become closed off to the ocean. Of course, when Wallaga Lake is closed, it can be manually opened by the council with a big digger. Which raises the question, what determines whether the manual option to open the lake is taken? An ICOLL management plan, which is a directive or statement on the issue of manually opening an ICOLL when it is closed. The current ICOLL policy in relation to any action of manually opening Wallaga Lake is that the situation is to be left to nature and its natural cycles in the natural system, which will open the lake when it feels like it. Now, I have a view on the ICOLL policy directive in relation to my local lake, Wallaga Lake. Wallaga Lake is separated from the ocean by a sand beach barrier, or a berm. This entrance barrier forms and breaks down depending on the movement and redistribution of sand and sediments by waves, tides, flood flows and winds. This determines whether the entrance is opened, kept open, or closed and kept closed. It opens and closes in an irregular cycle. When closed, the lake can fill up with water, and in theory, that water can go over the top of the berm, and this combined with tidal action can reopen the lake. In theory. Recently the lake filled, yet the sand berm was monstrously big, more like a massive dam wall. Even with the lake full, it was unlikely to top that dam wall. Occasionally the ocean would dribble over the top of it. Then, of course, we experienced that 1-in-100-year rain event, and the council was forced to manually open the lake as infrastructure around the lake, like the road, was seriously threatened. But what if we go into longer and longer periods of drought and a giant dam wall at the mouth was re-established? Would the lake ever open again when infrastructure is never threatened and the lake water levels never reach the trigger level which can be a justification for manually opening it? Of course, time will tell. One thing is for sure, something's missing that could keep the entrance open for longer periods than the brief periods that have been witnessed in the recent past. Before looking at ICOLL policy, let's look at the flow mechanics of Wallaga Lake. In the dim, distant past, there may have been a natural cycle or even a natural process. But in the here and now, there ain't nothing natural about the tidal flow cycle when the lake is open. It's been well and truly impacted from human interference. One point to make about the lake's tidal flow is that the lake doesn't scour sand effectively at the entrance. So if you manually open it, it hasn't in recent times stayed open for very long. One comment made in the ICOLL discussions about the moving of sand and water in and out of the entrance is that high-velocity outflows scour out an entrance channel and reduce the build-up of a berm to block the entrance. So that's fairly clear. Is there an impediment that substantially diminishes any tidal scouring cycle and flows through Wallaga Lake? Yes. A gastric band in the form of a road causeway put right across the middle of the lake. Truly, natural processes no longer exist. Oh, and as a consequence of the gastric band, the eastern basin has silted up and introduced a prostate problem that restricts the volume of the 6-hourly tidal cycle that can flow through the eastern basin when the lake is open to the ocean. The causeway, or gastric band, has literally turned the eastern basin of the lake into a massive silt trap. The volume of water coming from the ocean picks up sand and brings a load into the eastern basin. It is easy to witness what the current human-created blockage does, as water meanders about in the easterly basin and then has to slowly squeeze through a very narrow portal, and before a substantial proportion of the inflow can get past that point, the tide has already changed and is on its way out. The stymied and reduced flow due to the causeway results in the floating sand being brought in over decades and accreting and building up in the eastern basin. There is no longer a significant flush function to move any of the incoming layers out of the lake to any great extent. If this were a river mouth, the call would be put up for dredging. But that won't fix the problem, and the most effective way to address it is causeway conversion. What would physically help, to use a medical analogy, is to remove the lake's enlarged prostate. And the easiest and cheapest option in this is to install a concrete culvert bridge in the optimal position to maximise flow and velocity between the western and eastern basins. A position that would not affect the current bridge in any way. Then, in terms of the cyclic tidal flow, the lake, which is large enough and deep enough to amplify a large-scale cyclic flow, would take advantage of an expansive and full tidal cycle, maximum capacity inflow and maximum capacity discharge. One old-timers story that floats around is that in the era before the installation of the causeway, the lake rarely closed, and that was its natural state. What about inflows of water from the adjacent catchment region to the lake? What comes down and flows into the lake? Has the volume, quality, regularity, or composition of that inflow changed through time? You bet. When the lake is closed, this is the only source of water into the lake, and it's a result of rainfall. So, rainfall patterns, volumes of inflows, and regularity of inflows affect how full or empty the lake is. Longer dry spells mean both less volume and regularity coming into the lake, and at the same time, water will be evaporating from the lake and its level will gradually or even quickly drop. Let's not forget that there is a human impact on rainfall in our current time. That is human-induced global warming or heating, which is and has changed the patterns and systems that used to predominate throughout the region. The so-called natural system of the past, which regulated inundations into Wallaga Lake pre-global warming, no longer exists. Some recent discussions have suggested the catchment rainfall patterns in the long term may approximate a permanent status of semi-drought. Are there other human impacts on water catchment flows? Yes. Another factor affecting catchment flows into the lake is the rise of farming throughout the catchment region over generations. Farms naturally divert groundwater to dams. As the little waterways, rivulets, dry stream pathways have a dam put across them, this stymies and captures groundwater that would end up in Narira or Dignam's creeks and thus into Wallaga Lake. So small, medium, or even big storms don't see water bashing its way down through Narira Creek. It's normally always a dribble. Catchment development can also impact the composition of water flowing toward Wallaga Lake. Developmental disturbances release silts, which can be carried down into waterways and eventually the lake. Waterways can become stymied with silt, and over time there is a diminution of the strength of flows as well as volumes. Also, that siltation can lead to greater rates of evaporation of the water spread out across their newly created shallow surfaces. These are all human-manifested impacts upon the processes that Wallaga Lake is a part of. A dominant argument raised by the ICOLL directives for not artificially opening ICOLLs is the much vaunted and dreaded risk of a fish kill. We are told of the instance of an ICOLL being opened and a fish kill occurred. What about the myriad of openings where a fish kill doesn't occur? Or are there lakes where that is a likely occurrence and others where it is completely unlikely? Perhaps some ICOLLs are more prone to a fish kill event than others. Perhaps it's even an extreme rarity. Perhaps there is an optimal time to open an ICOLL. Perhaps actual knowledge in specific cases is better than baseless rumour. Fish kills are described as occurring due to anoxic conditions arising following the artificial opening of an ICOLL. It's mainly due to exposed mud and decaying vegetation resulting in a decrease in the oxygen levels in the water with a resultant fish kill. This is a lovely phenomena to know about, but when Wallaga Lake is open, in the eastern basin, sandbanks are exposed, and in the western basin, there are no exposed mud banks or the possibility of large areas of decaying vegetation. So surely this is not a factor when Wallaga Lake is open. Artificially opening the lake doesn't result in the mass decomposition of exposed aquatic vegetation. It drains, but even at low tide in the eastern basin, no seriously harmful mud or sediment banks or seagrass beds are revealed or exposed. In the western basin, again, no mud or sediment banks or weed seagrass beds are revealed when the lake is opened. So, I have witnessed in recent memory Durras Lake opened 4 times, Wallaga Lake opened 4 times, no fish kills. Yet still there is a blanket statement for ICOLLs that hangs over them that they can't or shouldn't be manually opened because of the risk of a fish kill. How about data and evidence be specifically considered for Wallaga Lake rather than a folklore-like motherhood statement preventing the rational evidence-based tailored management of Wallaga Lake, which may involve the regularly timed rejuvenation of the lake's fish populations through manual opening. When the lake is closed, you often hear people say that it looks dirty. What is the ICOLL policy's view on water quality? 1. It is often suggested that ICOLL entrances should be opened to flush out the dirty water and replenish it with clean seawater. 2. However, just because an ICOLL is closed does not necessarily mean that it has poor water quality. Many closed ICOLLs maintain good water quality and remain suitable for swimming, water sports, and fishing for long periods of time. 3. Furthermore, artificially opening an ICOLL entrance will not always improve the water quality due to the limited tidal movement or flushing in most ICOLLs. Okay. Note how it says in most ICOLLs. Begs the question, which ones? And also note the statement, remain suitable for long periods of time. What happens after that long period? It goes unsuitable? Now, for Wallaga Lake, there does not appear to be any substantive research or collected data on whether water quality improves if the lake is open. And perhaps there desperately needs to be full and comprehensive research on whether being open actually has a flushing and cleaning effect. Why? The recent local firestorm through the region put staggering quantities of ash into the air that blanketed the whole area. The lake received a significant load of that burnt carbon ash and soot by air and by rainfall washing it down from the adjacent catchment to the lake. Would that load, sitting in a closed lake, be poisonous or have a deleterious effect to the lake's aquatic ecosystems? There is no data or research to ascertain that. But if such a load were noxious to the lake, then manually opening it to re-establish a tidal flush that could potentially clear or at least diminish that black load in the lake, would be sound grounds for the manual opening of the lake. Should this be factored into a management plan of the lake? So, what is the DPI's take on whether opening an ICOLL replenishes species populations? Well, the points made are ICOLLs are very complex environments, and the impact of artificially opening entrances on fish species and fish habitats is not well understood. So, no comprende Wallaga Lake. Many species of estuarine fish and prawns that are targeted by recreational and commercial fishers breed in oceanic and coastal waters and enter estuaries and ICOLLs from the ocean as larvae and juveniles. Ha! But now an open ICOLL is a species highway. Geez, I'd wish they'd make up their minds. Long periods, i.e. 3 to 4 years or more, of entrance closure may restrict the recruitment of certain fish species to ICOLLs. Well, that's clear. Closing the highway may restrict the rejuvenation of species. Artificially opening an ICOLL entrance for the objective of enhancing fish recruitment would require a detailed sampling and analysis of offshore larval populations in the adjacent ocean area. Without such sampling, fish recruitment is not assured, and any success may ultimately depend, to a large extent, upon luck. How scientific! Now we are back to we know bugger all, so we can't and we won't do anything. Opening the ICOLL may benefit some species and disadvantage others, but we don't have any data or evidence one way or the other what will be the case. Oh yeah, this we don't do anything is a real chestnut. Still no data and research. Estuarine fish are adapted to the varying conditions experienced in ICOLLs, such as changing water levels and salinity. They can survive for many years in closed ICOLLs without the need for the entrance to be open to maintain the fish stocks. Fallback position. Don't know whether an open ICOLL helps fish populations replenish or rejuvenate, but hell, the fish already there are fine with the ICOLL being closed. They love it closed. Okay, so if flathead breeding near the entrance to estuaries is triggered by high salinity levels and the bream populations have been decimated by netting, how do other species replenish when the lake is closed? So let's try a summary. Okay, so an open mouth to the lake can be a replenishing freeway for a variety of species. But we don't know that because we don't have any detailed evidence of that. And we're not sure that will occur if we manually open the ICOLL. So, the DPI's suggested approach, fish replenishment rejuvenation is not grounds for artificially opening an ICOLL. Stating that no beneficial crossover rejuvenation or replenishment of fish species occurs when Wallaga Lake is open is like saying you can get cancer from riding your bike backwards. Nobody has done any research to prove or disprove either statement, so we will say that both statements are likely. How hard did they look for evidence in relation to Wallaga Lake? They should come fish the eastern basin of Wallaga Lake when it is closed and then when it is open, if they want evidence. When the lake is open, the yellowfin bream population is substantial, with that population moving back and forth between the lake and the ocean. Whenever the lake closes, the yellowfin bream population and the whiting population become minuscule. Why? There is no longer that sustaining and maintaining population movement happening. It's quite simple if you are sitting in a kayak looking down at the seagrass beds. When the lake opens, the flats near the mouth are abundant with hordes of yellowfin bream, flathead and whiting, moving into and out of the lake. When it is closed, those species become as common as competent politicians. Further, over-extraction of sexually mature fish by netting decimates and disrupts the reproductive cycle, so that the time span for repopulation blows out to a very long period or not at all. The influx of fish from the ocean an external source, helps in the repopulation cycle of the lake. This bare minimum compensation is better than nothing. Though the DPI seems to suggest when a lake is open, the mature breeders may leave. Ha ha ha. Fine if you can find some mature breeders in the first instance. Direct loss of habitat can occur where seagrass beds have established in entrance channels that then change as a result of artificial opening. Well, from a visual inspection of the eastern basin when the lake is open and it's low tide, the majority of the seagrass beds are not adversely affected by the opening of the lake. They remain covered in water even at low tide, and the veil of slime weed that proliferates and covers large areas of the lake tends to be scoured away such that the health of the seagrass beds improves. Fish communities when the lake is open appear to be much, much greater over those beds when the lake is open. When closed, they become the domain of large hordes of toadfish noodling over the top of mounds of slime weed. A description of the ecological and social values associated with the entrance area, example, roosting site of migratory birds, etc. ... When the lake is closed, the large sandbanks near the mouth are inundated. These sandbanks are resting and nesting areas for migratory birds over summer. Some of these birds are endangered. When the lake is open, they are not only viable resting places, but also the zone becomes a sanctuary. And it is cut off from dog owners who pull down no-dog signs and let their dogs loose, but in this instance are now thwarted by the tidal channel created between the headland and those bird resting zones. Okay, so the legislative view is that artificial opening of ICOLLs would potentially be detrimental to the vegetation that fringes an ICOLL in the long term. How is that position arrived at, you might ask? Looking at this issue in relation to ICOLLs, you just get some of the following statements. As the opening and closing of estuary entrances occurs naturally, the aquatic and fringing plant and animal communities have adapted to the accompanying variable environmental conditions. Okay, riparian or fringe vegetation adapts to environmental inconsistency. When ICOLLs are closed for long periods, some plants growing around the lake edges, such as casuarinas, may die from prolonged waterlogging. However, this is a natural process with riparian vegetation gradually advancing and retreating along the foreshore in response to varying water levels over time. So, when they are closed for a long period, flooded fringe plants will die. It should be remembered that flooding and drying are natural components of the hydrological and ecological processes operating within ICOLLs. Coastal lakes and the life they support have evolved in response to these forces, and to maintain a healthy lake, ideally, it should be left to operate as close to natural as possible. So opening and closing is a natural occurrence over time to the riparian communities. Over the long term, more frequent openings will lead to shifts in the structure and distribution of fringing riparian vegetation communities. Frequent openings and closings will change the structure and distribution of the riparian communities. Potential loss of riparian vegetation can be managed in ways other than artificially opening the entrance, including ensuring there are sufficient replacement plants growing on the landward side of the foreshore, i.e. maintaining or establishing riparian buffer areas, and planting or allowing natural rehabilitation of more suitable species that can tolerate wet, salty soils, such as salt marsh and mangroves. However, if it's closed, don't open it. Just plant more of what the closed lake is killing. What the ICOLL legislation contains is a broad statement that vegetation adjacent to the lake edges may not benefit from an ICOLL being open. Oh, and it may not benefit from it being closed as well. But with regard to the specific case of Wallaga Lake, who the hell knows? Well, the edges of Wallaga Lake and the copious weed beds appear for all intents and purposes to not suffer when the lake is open. Bear in mind that a large proportion of the shoreline is either a rock fringe, earth banks, or sandy beach-like verges. One clear benefit of an open lake is a massive decrease in the vileweed, referred to as slime weed, which fish species won't go near, and it appears to suck the oxygen and life out of areas of the lake in which it proliferates. Tidal action doesn't appear to favour it. Artificial breaching of the entrance barrier is undertaken to drain the ICOLL to the ocean and lower water levels, to relieve existing flooding of foreshore development and infrastructure, or avoid the likely threat of flooding which would occur before the ICOLL entrance opens naturally. That is the reason for opening Wallaga Lake. That is the reason for opening Wallaga Lake, i.e. flooded roads and property. But what is the formal trigger for opening the lake? What does the estuary management plan or entrance management policy state as the ultimate rule for when to open? Well, it is a set trigger water level at the estuary entrance measured in metres Australian height datum, AHD, above mean sea level, which must be reached before the entrance to the ocean will be artificially breached. I would argue that as we have strangled the Wallaga Lake system, perhaps it is time we step in and try to help the processes at work and encourage a modified version of the old cycles, which kept the lake in a rejuvenated and replenished state before humanity altered the flow dynamics of the lake and changed what does and doesn't flow into it and depopulated its species and deprived access of species to the lake for overly long periods. Seriously, Wallaga Lake needs a tailored, habitat and process-specific management plan. We need a new paradigm where artificial opening of the lake on a variety of levels would be regarded as a potential tool in a Wallaga Lake management plan. A plan that should not ignore the current hobbled flow dynamics and issues such as fish species regeneration, waterbird nesting and resting zones, flushing of the slime weed when it's covering the seagrass beds, and so on and so on. The ICOLL legislation and policy makes generalised statements in a non-specific, grandiose, cookie-cutter approach. Its universal statements, which in the case of fish species replenishment are not backed up by target-specific research and evidence, and are a questionable basis for creating a specific management plan for Wallaga Lake. Now, incessant and random opening of the lake is not being advocated. What is sought is a management plan that includes the option of manual opening as a management strategy, because at this point in time, there are factors, as mentioned, currently not adequately researched nor understood for Wallaga Lake. These factors must be taken into account when developing a management plan. The bottom line, we have no data, research or evidence across the board in relation to Wallaga Lake that taking no action is better than taking some form of action for the long-term holistic health of the lake. Does taking no action result in the system not degrading? We don't know. We have never researched that. Finally, Wallaga Lake has declined dramatically over the decades as a recreational fishery. When folk arrive and ask me what's the best fishing spot where they will have a good chance of catching fish, I tell them Wagga Inlet or Merimbula. The estuary perch population is missing, the black brim population is almost missing, and the big, sexually active, mature female flathead are barely noticeable. Now is the time for genuine research of what is best for Wallaga Lake.
The marketing men and real estate agents have taken over the world, and they spread their lies and madness as the multitudes lose all sense of purpose and meaning.